Did the name Israel come from a melding of three Egyptian gods? This is the question that is asked. Now, right off the bat, I can say no because you said three Egyptian gods, and that would take it out of contention based on your question. But if you said two Egyptian gods and one Canaanite god, then we can say there's a possibility. The argument can be made on both sides, but it depends on what perspective you're viewing this from. If you look at the name Israel from a modern day perspective and the modern day etymology of it, and according to looking at it from the time frame of 400 BCE forward, then you would say no. It has nothing to do with the Egyptian gods. It is purely the idea of the name meaning he who strives with God. And you would accept it in that format. And this is what the mainstream of Judaism as well as Christianity accepts the name Israel deriving from. But if you were to look at the linguistic archaeology concerning the name Israel and look at the history concerning the book of Genesis, then there it opens up the possibility that this is merely a combination of different gods during a time frame when the Israelites were both polytheistic as well as henotheistic. So we know that polytheistic means that you're believing in multiple gods. We know that henotheistic means that you believe in your God, but you accept the existence of other gods. So with that in mind, let's go through the history of the Israelite people. Now, one thing that we know for certain and know for sure is that the book of Genesis is claimed by um, apologist scholars that it was written in around the 1400s BCE. And they do this so that they can make the claim of the Bible that the Pentateuch, the book of Genesis, was written, book of Genesis and the first five books were written by Moses. And so they have to date it around the 1400s BCE in order for that part to be true. Because the Exodus story, according to their history and how they view history, had to have occurred in and around the 1400s. The problem that we have with that ideology is that we know that the Levant, Israel at that time, modern day Israel at that time frame, was ruled by Egypt in the 1400s. And Egypt didn't lose its grasp on that area until around 1100 BCE. So that opens up the door, since they were henotheistic at minimum, but also polytheistic at that time frame, that if they were around in the 1400s, that the name Israel could have been a combination of Isis, Ra, and El. Isis being the Egyptian goddess of the moon, Ra being the Egyptian god of the sun, and El being the Canaanite storm deity that would later become merged with Yahweh. So let me rephrase that. Yahweh is the storm deity, but El is the King of Kings, God of all gods. So let me put it that way. Um, Moon goddess, sun god, and then the god. So it could be a combination. When you look at it, you can make the argument, I should say, if you were to accept that it was written around the 1400s. Now, also, when we look at history, we know that the Exodus and none of those things could have happened during that time frame because Moses simply would have been exiting from one part of Egypt to another part of Egypt. That the conquering of Jericho and Ai and the Amorites and all these other people could not have happened during that time frame because the Egyptians were in control of those lands, were in control of those cities, even though those cities were, yes, vassal states that was occupied by other people. The Egyptians would not have allowed for that to happen. We know this through the Amarna letters that when Pharaoh Amarna was running Egypt, that many of the vassal kingdoms in that area were asking for help from the Habaru people. Now, the Habaru people has nothing to do with the Hebrew people. Habaru means poor people. Habaru means mercenaries. These were bandits. So these were not the people Joshua. This was not 2 million people wandering around the Levant. These were a nomadic bandits of nomadic poor bandits who were harassing the city states that were under the control of Egypt. So they don't fit the Habaru. People like to do that because the Hebrew Habaru sounds similar, but they are completely different in their meaning. So what do we have next? Our next archaeological evidence of the Israelite people and the first mentioning of an Israelite happens around 1204 with the Meneptah stele. For those who do not know, Pharaoh Meneptah boasts about conquering these other nations and city-states in the Levant, but mentions Israel as a people group, a nomadic people group, not a nation in 1204 BCE. So therefore, the Moses story is invalidated. The Joshua story, still invalidated. Could not have happened during that time frame because they were conquered by the Egyptians in 1204. So if there was any time frame that the Israelites were able to establish some type of nationhood, it would have had to have happened after the Bronze Age collapse, and it would have been an incredibly short time frame between that 1100 BCE till around 900 BCE, because then that area was conquered by the Amorites, and the Amorites controlled it. And then the Assyrians came and, well, I said Amorites. The Assyrians controlled it. Sorry, no, not the Amorites, but the Assyrians controlled the overwhelming majority of the land that is declared that Joshua conquered. The Amorites were east of that, but they control that area of land all the way down into the Sinai Peninsula, into northern Egypt. So the Assyrians conquered all of that land as part of the Assyrian Empire. So it could not have been. It could not have been. Those stories could not have been written at that time frame, nor be true at that time frame. But there was a people group called Israelites, and since they were during a time frame when Egypt controlled that area of land, and these people were formerly Canaanite people, it would make more sense that the name Israel at that time frame was a combination of Isis, Ra, and El, the Canaanite deity. But there's a problem with that. There's a big problem with that. And that is the fact that the name Isis didn't exist at that time frame. It didn't. The name would have been a set. So a set doesn't fit. Israel cannot have come from Isis because a set just doesn't fit. Because that is a Greek name for the Egyptian goddess Aset, who was married to Asar. So it just doesn't work. Ra still works. The name Ra would work, but it simply is not Isis. So since the Greeks didn't come into rulership in that area until around 300 BCE, it just doesn't work. So where does the name Israel actually comes from? It does fall in line with the idea of the name being created based on the Hebrew word that is spelled Y, how we would spell it in modern day, Yisrael, which would mean it is he who struggles, he who rules with God. But the El is Canaanite. We can know for certain and know for sure that the name El was originally a Canaanite god who was married to Asherah and who had children of Baal and Yahweh. And we can know for sure and for certain that Yahweh was then merged with the god El. And then in and around the 400 BCE, the ideas from the Persian belief in Zoroastrianism allowed for the Egyptians to return El not only as the God of all gods, but then becoming the only God, because in the Canaanite, El was the God of all gods. He was the chief God, and all the other gods were subordinate to him, which is why they were polytheistic and later on becoming and polytheistic and henotheistic at the same time. So it is a Canaanite deity that they believe in and that they then declared themselves under his rulership, but wanted to separate themselves from the other Canaanites that they were also members of. So I hope that that answers your question, and any other questions. Thank you for submitting that question. And always remember, we have to free ourselves to be ourselves because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.